Good morning, and thank you for joining us on day 2 of Leeds Digital Festival 2021. My name's Claire Cox and I work for the technology consultancy Scott Logic here in Leeds. Today I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Tamara Chehayeb Makarem, who'll be talking to us about how to cultivate empathy in the workplace. If you have questions for Tamara, please pop them into the question box and we'll take as many as we can at the end. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about your speaker. Tamara is a lead user experience designer at Scott Logic, where she designs web, desktop and mobile applications for clients in financial services and the public sector. She's worked in Beirut, London and New York and designed native and web applications for Fortune 500 companies. Tamara is married with 2 children, and I'm delighted to say that she has just been announced as a finalist for Outstanding Returner of the Year at this year's Women in Tech Awards, run by Computing Magazine. So huge congratulations to you, Tamara, and let me pass this over to you.
Thank you, Claire. So as the title suggests, I'm going to be talking today about cultivating empathy. But first, I want to start with a personal story. About 1.5 years ago, at the start of the first COVID lockdown, when the entire world was focused on the global pandemic we're in, it was the least of my worries, because I had much bigger worries. I found myself in the pediatric intensive care unit at Gosh, watching my 3-week-old baby in septic shock, intubated and fighting for his life. A chance that at the time I was told was 50%. I had been following up on all the test results, making sure I get every update, and I was messaging an amazing friend of mine who's a pediatrician to understand everything doctors were saying and the nurses were doing. But it seemed that all the test results were negative, and it was looking that the cause of the infection was not going to be known. Each morning, night nurses and day nurses switched shifts, and the doctors would do the rounds of all the patients in PQ to discuss any changes in the plan. On the 4th day, during the doctor's round, while the main consultant pediatrician was discussing the plan, he said, "Now that we know the cause of the infection," while pointing at his head. So I interrupted him to understand what he meant, because I wasn't told that any new results had come out. And he said, "Your son has pericovirus meningoencephalitis. It's a very rare virus, and he's probably the only person in London to currently have it." One of the younger doctors could see the expression of confusion, worry, and fear on my face, and nicely said that he'll write it down on a piece of paper for me. The consultant then said, "Don't Google it too quick." It was the most difficult time I had ever gone through in my life. As a mother, other than the worry you feel for your child, you also feel the guilt of not being able to protect them. Later that day, one of the doctors told me the only thing that made me feel slightly less pain in that moment. He said, "Your son was just very unlucky." This might seem something quite obvious to other doctors, but that specific doctor was able to understand that I was not only experiencing sadness, but also guilt. And he was trying to tell me, it's not your fault. He was just very unlucky. That understanding is what empathy is. Before I continue, I just want to say that my little Noah is perfectly healthy and fine now. And he's a very cheeky troublemaker, as you can see. So I started with a very personal example of empathy. In the rest of this talk, I'm going to explain what empathy is, the different types of empathy that we can develop. I will talk about what happens when you fundamentally disagree with someone and the benefits you get from cultivating empathy. I will also share some practical ways you can start cultivating empathy today in your own organization and help you build an awareness of what could potentially stop you from empathizing. So what is empathy? Empathy is the action of understanding how someone feels or experiencing the feelings of another without them having communicated it in an explicit manner. So it's about having that capacity to understand and being more sensitive to how someone else is feeling, but it's also about being aware of their thoughts and experience. It's not only about doing that, but it's doing it when someone hasn't necessarily explicitly told us how they're feeling. So it's also about noticing the verbal and nonverbal cues that someone might give and reading between the lines and projecting our imagination. When it comes to empathy, there are 3 recognized types. There's what we call cognitive empathy, and that's the logical and rational understanding of how someone feels. So it's about figuring out why someone is feeling a certain way. There's emotional empathy, and that's when the feeling is shared. So you might form a bond or a connection with the person. It's about taking on someone's feelings. And then there's compassionate empathy, which is a step beyond understanding how someone feels. You're concerned about them. You might even take action. You actually want them to feel better. So there are different types of empathy that we can develop. And our empathetic capacity deepens as our brain develops. So we start initially by being capable of emotional empathy. We might experience what the other person is feeling. And then we move to being capable of cognitive empathy. And that's when we're placing ourselves in the mind of another person. Cognitive empathy requires a more sophisticated capacity for language and a broader understanding that the world doesn't revolve entirely around us. And that's why it's something that we develop later as we're growing up. The fact that as our brain develops, our capacity to empathize progresses allows us to look at empathy as a skill that we can improve through practice, rather than it being something innate or a trait. So how does empathy actually work? It's always, I'm always been interested in knowing, whether there's anything that physically happens in the brain when we empathize. And there are 2 theories about this. The first one is the simulation theory. And it suggests that when we witness another person experience an emotion, we simulate the same emotion and we feel it ourselves. And that there are mirror neurons that fire in our brain and a specific part of our brain is activated. So this theory suggests an automatic and emotional response. The other theory is called the theory of the mind. And psychology today defines it as the ability to understand what another person is thinking and feeling based on rules for how one should think and feel. This suggests a reflective and conceptual response. And this theory was quite popular in clinical work on autism, showing that autistic people cannot effectively represent or explain the mental state of another. Now, the 2 theories don't contradict each other. And actually, the diagram on the right is from a paper that proposes that there is neuroanatomical evidence that supports the 2 possible empathy systems, so the emotional one and the more cognitive system. This model suggests that the systems are dissociable and may be activated in different situations. The other thing that it suggests is that damage in certain areas of the brain, depending on where that is, could impact one or the other system. So it's important to recognize that for some, the ability to empathize can be impacted, but for the majority of people, empathy is something that can be developed. Now, something that you might be wondering is, well, what happens if you fundamentally disagree with someone? Let's say someone attacks your religious beliefs or what you might consider an individual right for you. Can you empathize with someone you fundamentally disagree with? And the short answer is yes. Empathy is not endorsement. You can empathize with someone you disagree with, and very often this is when empathy is most needed, but it's also when it's most difficult. I want to mention here a guy called Dylan Marin, who's done a really great experiment with this. So he's an activist who creates a lot of digital content. And when his work got famous, he started receiving a lot of hate online. He decided to contact some of the people that wrote the hateful posts and used the conversations in his podcast, which he entitled Conversations with People Who Hate Me. In the podcast, he contacts all the people who left negative or hateful comments for him on social media to try to understand why they wrote what they did. His goal was to take hateful conversations online and turn them into productive conversations offline. One of the guys he contacted had even written that being gay was a sin. When he talked to him, he found out that they actually had something in common. They were both bullied at school. The conversation humanized them to each other, even though they have very different beliefs. He talks about how these conversations allowed him to acknowledge the humanity of someone raised to be very different to him, and that doesn't compromise his own beliefs. At the end of the conversations he has with these people, very often there's a moment of reflection and reconsideration. They were able to empathize with someone they disagreed with. Now, to say that we can empathize with someone we disagree with is to imply that empathy is actually a choice we make. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, is that empathy is a choice that you make. There's even evidence that we actually decide on whether we want to empathize or not with others. Researchers at Penn State's Empathy and Moral Psychology Lab discovered that cognitive empathy operates along an economic framework. We subconsciously assess the costs and benefits of attempting to understand another person before choosing to do so. Going back to Dylan's example, there are a lot of fascinating things that came out of from his experiment when he chose to talk to the people who left him hateful comments. But one of the points that is very interesting is the impact that being online or in a remote environment has on decreasing empathy and making it more easy for people to be hurtful to others. When people were leaving comments for him online, it made it less personal and more easy to write negative things. They didn't picture a human reading this on the other side. This is something for all of us to keep in mind as we're still working remotely and often only have a voice on the other side of a Zoom meeting. Putting a picture, having our video on can create a more personal connection and encourage more empathy. Well, you might be thinking, well, why should we choose to empathize? Why is empathy important? Empathy is important simply because it allows to increase our capacity for connection, and it allows to build better relationships, whether it's in our personal life, whether it's with a client, with people we line manage, with teams we lead, users we design for. Empathy helps us understand people's unique needs and helps us even understand nonverbal cues that they might give. It allows us to adapt our leadership style. When we show empathy, people are more willing to share with us more personal things, which allows us to have a more informed and tailored leadership approach so that we can support them. If we're able to understand what motivates other people, we are in a much better position to help them. For example, as a line manager, I try to find out what motivates people I line manage. Is it working on a particular type of project with a particular technology that they want to develop? Is it money? Is it getting the opportunity to get involved in things beyond their craft? Is it being on a large team and the chance to socialize more? Empathy allows us to understand what motivates others, but it also allows us to be more mindful of how we affect others and understand how our words and our actions can influence them. The second reason why empathy is important is because it allows us to create a culture of openness in an organization. It helps build trust and collaboration so that we're able to develop more caring and compassionate relationships. When we build trust, people feel that they can trust others with their ideas and share their ideas. So it allows the organization to be more creative. For example, if you're collaborating with others in your team on a project, recognizing the effort someone's putting in and crediting them for their work and ideas will encourage them to keep sharing their ideas, and will encourage others to do the same. After this talk, maybe take a moment to think about what you're currently working on or what people in your team are working on, and whether there's anyone you want to reach out to and thank for the effort that they're putting in. Empathy also helps us resolve conflict a lot more easily because it allows us to integrate diverse perspectives and allows us to look at the bigger picture. We shift the focus from attacking or ignoring to understanding anyone who thinks differently. And having to resolve conflict is something we encounter quite often on projects. Stakeholders could have different views and approaches for what they believe the right solution is, but rather than focusing on differences in the solutions, empathy allows us to shift the focus on the reasoning behind each solution and the problems we're trying to solve. So the big question is, how do we cultivate empathy? In order to cultivate empathy, we need to create an environment that encourages everyone to humanize the person on the other end of a conversation so that a dialogue can start. A very good way to humanize the person on the other end is by knowing their story, which is also why it's important to share something personal sometimes. I shared with you a personal story at the start of this. It might help you get to know me better as a person. Sharing stories is a very impactful way of cultivating empathy. We've all heard the phrase, walking in someone else's shoes. What we're looking at here is a project by the Empathy Museum. They designed an art exhibit that literally allows people to walk in other people's shoes. It's called A Mile in My Shoes, and it's housed in a giant shoe box where visitors are invited to walk in someone else's shoes. There's a diverse collection of shoes and audio stories they can choose from, and they're invited to walk a mile in the shoes of a stranger while listening to their story. This could be a sex worker, a war veteran, neurosurgeon. They use participatory storytelling as a way to get visitors to see the world through the perspective of others. I'm going to give you another example where a story can change our perspective. There was recently a post from an Afghan refugee that went viral. He posted a picture of a meal given to him and wrote, "Not complaining, but this is what I got last night for dinner, and the next meal is 12 hours later. Refugee life might be safe, but never easy and favorable." Some people thought that he is ungrateful because people lost their lives so that he can live. Other people thought that this guy is just trying to show that the reality of the life of a refugee is not as nice as some people might think, and that it's not a choice people want to make. Just like with the example of Dylan Marin, it's very easy to form a negative view of someone unknown to you. I hear a lot of negative comments about immigrants and refugees, and I understand the place where someone making these comments might come from. I myself was an immigrant. I originally come from Lebanon, a country where today almost a third of its population is Palestinian and Syrian refugees. Some Lebanese link the refugee presence with high crime rates, and others even blame them for the civil war. Over time, it's difficult not to build a negative view of anything associated with refugees. But then you watch documentaries where people in these refugee camps are interviewed, and you hear their stories. You hear the story of a very accomplished Syrian medical consultant who worked really hard his entire life and built a great home for his family, and then had to leave it all behind to move to a country where he does not feel welcome and to live in a camp where he cannot even practice the skills he's highly qualified in. When you hear the story of that individual, you are able to be more empathetic than when it's someone unknown that is part of a large group portrayed very negatively. Going back to the tweet from the Afghan refugee, both sides are actually correct. The two sides are not contradictory. This person projects the image of someone ungrateful because he seems to be complaining about the amount of food he received when people have sacrificed their lives so that he could live and be free. But also, this person projects the image of the reality of what a refugee life is like. He may have heard a hurtful comment about refugee before he wrote that post, and people reading the post may have just been watching the news about their own soldiers being killed in Afghanistan. When we talk about empathy, there's a giver of empathy and a receiver of empathy. But we can only start a dialogue when both sides become givers and receivers of empathy. Neither side needs to change their beliefs, but both should attempt to understand where the other person is coming from. Empathy works much better when it's reciprocated. And reciprocation of empathy is what allows us to create a culture where everyone is aware of everyone's needs and emotions. Learning someone's story makes it easy or easier to humanize them and understand where they're coming from. But sometimes we might not be told the story, and we might need to use our own imagination a bit. A few months ago, I got this apology email sent from Boots Photo, I believe to anyone who either opted into or didn't opt out of receiving marketing mail. And they wrote, "We recently sent an email about decorating a nursery. As a sensitive topic for some, we would like to sincerely apologize if this caused any upset. My instant reaction was to go look at the initial email they sent, which you can see on the right, and which seemed perfectly fine. My second reaction was how ridiculous it is that they need to apologize for sending an advertisement about personalizing a nursery, and that we're turning into a world where no one can say anything anymore. That reaction was not very empathetic, but I'm sure that many of you might have the same reaction now. I did make the assumption that Boots must have received an angry email, possibly from a woman who got upset because she had recently maybe lost a baby. I understood why someone would be upset seeing that email. I myself would have been upset to receive such an email while praying for my son in the pediatric intensive care unit. But what I couldn't understand is why someone would think that Boots should not be sending such an email, especially that it's the sort of email that you opt into receiving, and especially that they had sent other emails about other themes. I decided to make more of an effort to think about why someone would think that this email shouldn't be sent to them. And I came to the realization that when the person who subscribed to this opted into receiving emails from Boots Photo, they opted into a service that allows them to print photos. And there's nothing in that links specifically to babies or nurseries. I also realized that my assumption about who might have complained about the email could be wrong. It could be a woman in her 20s that's going through early menopause, which is something that I only recently discovered happens to some women. It could even be a gay man who's being pressured by his parents to get married and give them grandkids, but hasn't even been able to come out to them yet. It might even be someone who's not affected by this at all, but who can see how this could affect others and decided to alert Boots about it. We can keep imagining more and more scenarios about, and sometimes it's what we need to do. We don't know the story. We need that imagination to enable us to empathize. Empathy is something that I personally use every day in my day-to-day job. As a user experience designer, I wouldn't be able to do my job effectively without empathizing with users and understanding their needs. And there's actually a process in UX for doing that, and it's called empathy mapping. We map our findings into a map that looks like this. We try to think about what a user is doing, seeing, hearing, saying, what their pain points are, what their goals are. It allows us to have a picture, to build that picture of them and understand what motivates them and how they work. You might be thinking, well, how does this affect me? How can you apply this in your day-to-day job and cultivate empathy in your own workplace? So I'm going to talk about some of the more practical applications of all this. There are a few techniques we can use to improve our empathy skill. One of the things we can do is to practice active listening, which is something that we started doing at Scott Logic. We do sessions with a speaker, a listener, and an observer, where they go through an exercise. We recommend techniques that the listener can use. The first one is to use positive words and sounds to encourage the speaker to share information, especially when this is done remotely. We also practice our facial expression and posture. Another technique we encourage is the use of reflection. So we encourage listeners to reflect back on something the speaker has said. The listener can also summarize what the speaker said. And this is a good technique to validate that our understanding of what the speaker said is correct. One of the main techniques that we also encourage is to use open questions instead of closed or yes or no questions. You can use this technique even with clients you're working with. For example, rather than asking a client, would delivering this solution allows you to achieve your goal, you could ask a more open question and say, what would success look like to you? And get them to elaborate on the problems and their pain points rather than a specific solution. By being inquisitive and non-judgmental, we're able to empathize more and to understand. Active listening is a very good way for developing empathy skills. And you can see that used a lot by people who work in customer support. They tend to be well-trained in using some of the active listening techniques. They often use expressions like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. They tend to use more informal language and more personal pronouns. Another thing that helps cultivate empathy is diversity and inclusion training. We might think that we need to cultivate empathy to enable diversity and inclusion initiatives, but I think it works both ways. Having a diversity and inclusion training allows us to view the different perspectives that we might not even be aware of and helps us cultivate empathy. I was quite pleased when leaders within Scott Logic shared that they're investing in diversity and inclusion courses to help them learn about how to be more inclusive leaders and better communicate with more diverse individuals. We can also cultivate empathy in the workplace by making sure we understand the impact that life changes or life events have on employees and provide the right support. The events could have social, physical, or psychological impact, so we need to offer material, physical, and emotional support. It's important to realize that some events can be positive while others negative. Some may be expected and you can plan for, but others could be unexpected. Some may be temporary, some may last longer. The impact is quite subjective to each individual. And the more we know the person, the better we're able to support them. The organization plans that support, but every individual plays a part in shaping it. As a line manager, I need to know how to support the people I line manage. We also need to know how to support our colleagues, recognizing that everyone has a life outside of their work life and might at a certain point need more support, allows us to empathize better. It could be something as simple as being aware that someone is doing their job while homeschooling kids in the background. The more open we are about these things, the more others are, and the easier it is to support each other. The fourth point that I have in the list here might seem a bit unusual because many of us think of vulnerability as a weakness. If you haven't seen Brené Brown's research on vulnerability and shame, it's definitely worth doing that. She did some brilliant research that explained how vulnerability is not a weakness, but rather is about emotional risk. And it's one of the most accurate measures of courage. She explains how, in order to allow for connection to happen, we have to be seen. So we have to show vulnerability. She found in her research that people who have a sense of strong love and belonging are people who feel they are worthy of love and belonging. And that what these people have in common are a sense of courage, the courage to be imperfect, compassion to themselves and to others, connection as a result of authenticity, and they all fully embraced vulnerability and saw it as necessary. She explains how we all tend to try to numb vulnerability, and by doing that, we also numb all other emotions like joy and happiness. We try to make everything that is uncertain certain, whether it's about politics, religion, or any topic. She found that people who were able to build meaningful connections were ones who showed vulnerability. I'm going to give you a simple example of how even showing a very minute vulnerability can establish a connection. If a client asks you about a particular topic as someone who should be the expert, and you might not know the answer, you could try to come up with some answer, which won't be good. Or you could say that you don't know the answer to that particular question, but that you look into it and get back to them. That simple, tiny indication of vulnerability actually builds trust with that client because they know you're honest and that when you actually give them an answer, it will be one that is well thought one. These are just 4 things that we can start doing in the workplace to help cultivate empathy. There's one last thing that I want to mention, and it's about what could stop empathy from happening. I believe that the most dangerous thing for empathy is fear. You might have heard of the Milgram shock experiment. It tests how far people would go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. In this experiment, there's a participant, an experimenter, and a student. Anytime the student gives the wrong answer, the participant is asked by the experimenter to inflict pain on that student. The experimenter and student were acting, but the participant didn't know that, and they thought that they were actually inflicting pain on the student for getting the wrong answer. The participants in this experiment find themselves in a social dilemma. They feel compelled to follow the experimenter's command to administer pain on another person, while at the same time feeling driven to avoid causing harm. So there's a conflict between obedience to authority and personal conscience. All 40 participants in this experiment proceeded to administer electric shocks on the students. I mention this example because I think the fear of not obeying authority took over the feeling of empathy in this situation and led to that outcome. Fear drives irrational behavior. We fear that if we open up to others, it makes us weak. We fear that if we try to understand others, it makes us question our own beliefs. We fear what we don't know. We fear people who are different. We might even fear feeling someone else's pain. The Milgram shock experiment is an extreme example of the level of fear experienced by participants. In our everyday life, fear can take a much more subtle form. In the example where a client asks you a question you don't know the answer to, you may fear looking inexperienced if you can't come up with an answer, and you might decide to bluff it. Fear is the biggest enemy of empathy, and to enable cultivating empathy, we need to make sure that we create a culture where we remove fear. When I decided to give this talk, I knew empathy was important and very prevalent in our personal lives, but I hadn't appreciated the extent of its application in our day-to-day job, in our ability to establish connections, adapt our leadership style, become better consultants with clients, resolve conflict on projects, and build an open culture that allows us to foster creativity. I learned through my research that empathy is a strength. It is not passive, and it does not imply agreement. It is a skill that we can develop and a choice that we make. And we do that by actively listening to others, by sharing our story and encouraging others to do the same, by recognizing the hard work of others and crediting them for that, and by accounting for individuals' current and unique circumstances when we make decisions. I hope that this talk will encourage you to apply some of these techniques in your day-to-day job and leverage the strength that empathy gives you in building meaningful connections with your clients and with your colleagues.